Hello and welcome to the Mr. Brown podcast, where I reflect on my journey as an early career teacher, with a special focus on mental health. I am your host, James Brown. Salutations. There are two things I would like to discuss this week. Two main things, and then I'll end on an amusing story. The first thing I'd like to discuss is that I had the privilege this past week of observing a colleague. Now, this colleague has been an enigma to me for rather a while. He is one of, if not the most experienced teachers at my school. He's renowned for his prodigious use of mini whiteboards and for being able to manage even the most difficult of classes. And yet we rarely see him. Compared to other colleagues in the department anyway, we rarely see him. This is because he's part-time and he doesn't hang out in the office much. He likes to do his lesson planning and preparation in classrooms. So yes, he's quite elusive, yet he's revered by everyone at the school. And so it was a real pleasure for me this week to be able to observe him teach. And this wasn't the only privilege. I observed this colleague teach with another colleague, another expert teacher. I think she is perhaps second only to him in terms of experience. She sat with me and guided my attention to different things that the teacher was doing to help me figure out exactly what it was that makes him so effective. So I think between them, they won't mind me saying this, but between them, I think they have nearly half a century of experience teaching mathematics in what at times can be a challenging school. So this was such a privilege and such a learning experience for me. So yes, what did I learn? So a bit of context, it was a revision lesson with year 8. They were revising fractions, decimals and percentages ahead of an assessment later in the week. And two things jumped out at me. On reflection, two things jumped out at me that I think made this teacher special. First, the lesson was largely, if not entirely, student-directed. I'll give just a couple of examples. So they had a set number of questions, revision questions that they were going to work through. They were all using mini whiteboards, and much of the lesson proceeded via discussion. There was so much dialogue and discussion between the teacher and the students, and much of the knowledge that they were revising was being drawn out of the students in an expert way. It was being guided out of the students. And this created a real sense of buy-in. The students felt like they were really contributing. They weren't just passive absorbers of information, but rather it seemed to be the students themselves who were generating the information. They were kind of all buying into this collective endeavour with this expert guide of a teacher at the front who was drawing them in the right direction. So I'd say that's the first and perhaps the most important example of how the lesson was student-directed. The second is that, and this terrifies me a little bit, there was no seating plan. Students, and this is a class that has the potential to be tricky. I taught them earlier in the year and it was a bit of a headache. Yet this experienced teacher had allowed them to sit wherever they wanted. Well, wherever they thought that they would learn best. So it wasn't that they were allowed to sit wherever they wanted with their friends, for example. The teacher had gotten students to think carefully about where they should sit in order to learn best. On the condition that if it turned out that wasn't a good spot for them to learn, or if they were distracting others, then they would move. But as far as I'm aware, no one had been moved. Now, I've spoken before about the importance of autonomy on the podcast, I keep referring back to self-determination theory. It's a theory of motivation. I do feel that the best teachers are the best motivators. And self-determination theory tells us that we all have these three innate psychological needs for autonomy, competence, and belonging. And that if something or someone can satisfy these needs in us, then we are more likely to be well motivated. And I would say that this teacher was expertly satisfying the need for autonomy in his students by having this student-directed approach where the knowledge was being drawn out of the students and they were also allowed to sit where they wanted, wherever they thought would be best for their learning. So it was very much a collaborative joint endeavour where students felt a real sense of agency, and I think that perhaps is the key to his success with these sorts of classes. But there was another aspect. Something else jumped out at me. And this was something I hadn't really noticed before in other teachers. Perhaps, I think maybe lots of expert teachers do it, but this was the first time that I really managed to spot it. So if I had to describe this teacher in a nutshell, I would say that he is a master of attention. And pretty much all students attended to him almost exclusively throughout the entire lesson. And how on earth did he achieve this? Well, I think he achieved this feat via a series of subtle setups and payoffs. Now, anyone who enjoys reading novels will be familiar with the idea of setups and payoffs. It's the idea of kind of building up dramatic tension before getting some sort of catharsis or resolution at the end. Anyone who enjoys TV even, good TV, you'll see this all the time. Whenever you find yourself thinking, oh my God, how's this going to play out? What's going to happen next? You're in the grip of a setup and you're waiting for the payoff. And this teacher managed to create these setups and payoffs in a FDP revision lesson with a tricky Year 8 class. I'll give two examples. The first, at the start of the lesson, he wrote 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6 on the whiteboard. And these numbers referred to the 6 questions that they were going to revise that lesson. And then next to each of those question numbers, he wrote down how many of the students in the class he thought would be able to answer the question correctly. So he wrote all next to the first 2, because he thought that all students in the class would be able to get those. And then next to the third, I think he wrote 12, and then the fourth was 6. I think the fifth was maybe only 2. And then the final question, number 6, which was going to be the trickiest, he just put a question mark by. And so right there at the very start of the lesson, he's creating dramatic tension. And any students in that class with a slight competitive edge are going to want to make sure that they're among the students who are able to answer those questions. And also they'll be looking forward to finding out whether the teacher was right about how many of them were going to be able to answer the questions. So there was this anticipation, this dramatic tension that had built up already. So that was kind of an overarching setup that kind of pervaded the entire lesson. But then you also had these mini setups and payoffs throughout. So after each question, the teacher would go round the class and collect answers from students and sometimes collect methods and write all these different candidate answers or methods on the board. On at least one occasion as well, he would then get students to vote on which answer or method they thought was the correct one before revealing which one was correct. And so all the while, this dramatic tension is building further and further. Students are thinking, So first of all, whether they're going to be among the students who gets this question right. And then when they're doing the question, they're thinking which one of these methods or answers that's on the board is going to be the correct one. And so they were engaged. They were locked in, as they would say. They had this emotional buy-in and they were waiting for the resolution or the catharsis. So in the same way that an expert author or filmmaker captures their audience's attention with all these subtle setups and payoffs, so too did this maths teacher. It was wonderful to watch. So he's less of an enigma now to me. And I understand why he's so revered, and I have at least some insight into how he has such success with classes which have the potential to be quite difficult. It's the student-directedness of the lessons which satisfies in students their innate psychological need for autonomy and therefore motivates them. And then it's also all these setups and payoffs which manage to get students emotionally invested in the lesson and to create a sense of anticipation so that they're locked in, they're engaged, and they're attending. Like I said, I think the best way to describe this teacher, I've only observed him once and I do hope to observe him again, but from what I saw, I do believe he is a master of capturing attention. That was the first thing I'd like to discuss today. Before progressing on to the second, my usual Patreon plea. This episode took around 2 hours to produce, and I aim to produce 2 episodes a month. If you think that work is worth at least the price of a coffee, so that's £2 to £3, once a month, then please consider signing up on Patreon and helping me cover the cost of producing the podcast. It doesn't cost a lot, but any contribution would be greatly appreciated. And if you sign up on Patreon, you'll get exclusive early access to videos of my recording sessions. As always, there'll be a link in the show notes. Thank you ever so much. Okay, the second thing I'd like to discuss this week is the equity-oriented approach to teaching. I think many teachers, myself included, like to think of themselves as equity-minded, or at least sensitive to issues concerning equity. But what do we mean by equity? I think a lot of us will have seen that famous image which attempts to distinguish between an equality-based approach and an equity-based approach. There are 3 children of increasing height trying to see over a fence in order to watch, I think it's a baseball game. In the first image, the equality-based image, they are each given 1 crate to stand on. The tallest among the children now clears the fence by several feet. I mean, he could see over the fence to begin with anyway. The middle height child can now just about see over the fence. However, the shortest among the children, with only 1 crate, still can't see over the fence. That's the equality-based approach. Contrast this with the equity-based approach, where 2 boxes are given to the shortest child, 1 box is given to the middle child, and no boxes are given to the tallest child. Now all 3 children can see over the fence in order to watch the baseball game. And so the idea here is inequalities in the distribution of resources, so in this example crates, can be just or the right thing to do if it benefits the least advantaged. So equity is ultimately about directing more resources to disadvantaged children in order to level the playing field. That's the phrase that often comes up again and again when people discuss about equity. It's about leveling the playing field. Now, in the name of equity, I feel that I have tolerated some disruptive behaviour more than I perhaps should have done. So I might have a student who in a lesson is being disruptive, very disruptive at times, and on reflection later, I think I should have just kicked them out. Now, what was it that stopped me from kicking them out? in the moment? Well, I'm aware that if the student is removed from the lesson, then they will lose learning and they will fall further behind their peers. And that doesn't sit well with my equity-based principles. I don't want this student to fall further behind their peers. I want to level the playing field. And so I end up tolerating their disruptive behaviour far longer than I perhaps should have, in the name of equity. I want to keep them in the lessons in the hope that they will learn at least something in order to level the playing field. On reflection, however, we know that equity is about directing more resources to the least advantaged. And here I am trying to enact the principle of equity by tolerating disruptive behaviour. But I'm making an assumption here. I'm assuming that there's a connection between being disadvantaged and behaving in a disruptive way. I'm assuming that if a student behaves badly in my lessons, that means they're disadvantaged. And because I'm equity-minded, I need to give them more chances, basically. Direct more resources, more of my time and energy to them in order to level the playing field. But I don't know whether that assumption's true. If a student is misbehaving in my lessons, does that mean that they're disadvantaged? Does that mean that they should be the target of the equity-minded teacher in terms of resource allocation? I don't know whether it does. I mean, what do we mean by disadvantaged? John Rawls, who wrote A Theory of Justice in, I think it was the early 70s, but it's a very famous book. He defines the least advantaged as those belonging to the lowest income class with the least expectations. So basically, the least advantaged for John Rawls are the poorest among us. And I think that's a common sense definition. Being disadvantaged means being poor. Or being relatively disadvantaged means being poorer than other people. Let's put it that way. And so if I have a student who's being disruptive in my lessons, can I safely infer that they are poor? Is there any inherent connection between being poor and behaving badly in lessons? Or behaving badly in general? And of course there isn't. Of course there isn't. It's absurd to think that way. In fact, some of the least advantaged students I've taught in economic terms, so I'm thinking of students who are perhaps refugees, are some of the best behaved and most studious and most polite and most determined to do well. And during my training year, my first placement school was at a school in a very affluent area with lots of students who were from very wealthy backgrounds, and the behaviour among some of those students was awful. So there is no connection between poor behaviour and being poor economically. There just isn't. And so, if as an equity-oriented teacher, I've found myself tolerating disruptive behaviour in my lessons, then that's completely muddle-headed. In fact, by doing that, if I end up directing more of my time and energy and resources to the more disruptive students in my lessons, that will perhaps prevent me from achieving the aims of equity. Because there may be other students in the class who do meet the definition of disadvantage. They are perhaps from the lowest income class with the least expectations, as John Rawls defines it. But because I'm being distracted and having to spend so much time trying to address disruptive behaviour, I can't spend any time with those students. This seems to have turned into a bit of a rant. What am I trying to say here? What I'm trying to say is that it's important to know your students well. Some students perhaps will behave in a more disruptive fashion because they are genuinely disadvantaged. But you can't assume that that's true in every case. You can't assume that every student who is disruptive does so because they are disadvantaged. And if they're not disadvantaged, then they are not the target of an equity-based approach. In fact, they may undermine or frustrate realising the principle of equity. There you go. Bit of a ramble. I promised that I would end this episode on a funny story. So, here we go. I have a tricky Year 7 class. And I had spoken to a colleague about this tricky Year 7 class. And she had offered to come in and support. Anyway, later that day, I was teaching this tricky Year 7 class. I love this class. I'm very emotionally invested in this class, but they can be challenging. I've spoken about them before. And about halfway through the lesson, a big blue notification appears on the screen saying your laptop battery is very low. You need to plug it in now. I'm sure we've all been there as a teacher. So I say, oh no, my laptop's about to die, and I start scrambling for my charger. I find it so frustrating if my laptop dies. I like to line up all of my PowerPoint presentations for the day and have all my documents open and get all my tabs ordered so that I can just work through them throughout the day. And if my laptop dies, I'll lose all of that. It's a nightmare. Yes, I said, oh, my laptop's about to die, started scrambling for my charger. And what did the students do? They thought this was very entertaining. Well, they started banging their fists on the table and chanting, die, 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 die. Just as my colleague walked in. So my colleague, who I had warned about this class and who had very kindly offered to support me, walked in just at the point where all the students were banging their fists on the table, chanting, die, 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 which was quite the welcome. There you go. I hope you enjoyed today's episode. We will talk again soon. If you enjoyed this episode, please spread the word in person and on social media. You can follow me on Twitter at Mr. BrownPod or email mrbrownpod@gmail.com. Please subscribe, rate and review in your directory of choice. Please also consider becoming a patron at patreon.com/Mr. BrownPod and helping me cover the cost of producing the podcast. Thank you, and talk again soon.